Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to discuss one of the most significant developments in India's economic and political landscape. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's ambitious tax overhaul. This reform arrives at a particularly sensitive time when India faces not only domestic economic pressures, but also mounting global trade tensions, especially with the United States. The U.S. tariffs and ongoing disputes have placed India in a challenging position, forcing the government to balance fiscal responsibility with political necessity. At its core, Modi's tax reform represents more than just a shift in numbers and revenue. It is a bold political move designed to reshape public perception, signaling that the government is prioritizing relief for farmers, households, and small businesses at a time of uncertainty. While experts warn of potential strains on public finances, the reform simultaneously enhances Modi's image as a leader deeply connected to the aspirations of ordinary Indians. This duality, economic strain versus political strength, will be at the heart of our discussion. We will explore how the tax overhaul may impact India's fiscal health, global trade negotiations, and Modi's leadership standing, both within the country and on the international stage. Ladies and gentlemen, to understand the domestic economic impact of Prime Minister Modi's tax overhaul, we must return to a simple but powerful truth. Taxes are the lifeblood of any government. They fund the roads we travel on, the hospitals we depend upon, the defense systems that protect our borders, and the welfare schemes that lift millions from poverty. When a government chooses to reduce taxes, it is not simply performing an act of generosity. It is recalibrating the entire balance between revenue collection and citizen relief. India's economy has long suffered from what many call the compliance burden. Small shopkeepers in rural towns, mid-sized enterprises in cities like Surat or Pune, and even large corporations in Delhi and Mumbai often found themselves drowning in paperwork. Different states levied different taxes. Goods moving from one state to another faced checkpoints, delays, and overlapping levies. The GST system introduced in 2017 was supposed to solve this by creating one nation, one tax. However, over time, the system became clogged with multiple slabs: 5%, 12%, 18%, and 28%. For a common trader, this meant confusion. Is a particular good taxed at 12% or 18%? Why did some essentials face higher rates than luxuries? The result was frustration and inefficiency. With this new overhaul, Modi has signaled his intent to simplify. Essential goods such as food items, basic clothing, and household necessities are to be brought under lower tax brackets. Certain categories of electronics and consumer goods are shifted downward as well, making them more affordable for India's expanding middle class. For families, this translates into greater purchasing power. When a household saves even a few hundred rupees on monthly essentials, that money is often redirected into other spending on education, on healthcare, or even small luxuries. Thus, the tax overhaul becomes an economic stimulus without the government directly handing out subsidies. Businesses, too, stand to gain. Lower rates mean fewer disputes with tax authorities, fewer compliance headaches, and lower overall costs of doing business. In an economy where MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises count for nearly 30% of GDP, this relief could energize a sector that has struggled since the twin shocks of demonetization and the pandemic. But here lies the challenge. When the government reduces tax rates, its immediate revenues decline. Estimates suggest that the Indian government could lose as much as 1.5 trillion rupees annually from these changes. To put this in perspective, that is nearly equivalent to the entire health budget of the union government. Critics argue that such a large hole in revenues could weaken India's ability to invest in infrastructure, rural development, and social welfare. So why would Modi take such a risk? The answer lies in a combination of short-term stimulus and long-term optimism. Economists often refer to the concept of the Laffer curve, the idea that lowering taxes can paradoxically increase overall revenue if it stimulates greater economic activity. Modi's bet is that by making goods cheaper and compliance simpler, more businesses will move into the formal economy. More citizens will pay taxes and consumer demand will grow so significantly that the government will in time recover its revenue losses. Moreover, this move is not only about arithmetic, 'tis about psychology. In a country where inflation has remained a top concern, where citizens feel squeezed by rising prices of food, fuel, and household items, a tax cut provides immediate psychological relief. It builds confidence, it creates goodwill, sends the message that the government is listening to its people. And in politics, perception often matters as much as policy. We must also consider timing. This overhaul comes at a moment when India faces external trade uncertainties with the United States. Higher U.S. tariffs on Indian exports, particularly in textiles, steel, and certain manufactured goods could hurt Indian producers. By cutting domestic taxes, Modi effectively shields these producers by giving them cost relief at home, even as their goods face higher costs abroad. It is a cushion against the volatility of global trade. At the same time, this reform dovetails neatly with Modi's broader vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India. By reducing tax burdens on local industries and consumers, the government encourages domestic demand to drive growth, rather than relying excessively on exports. In this sense, the tax overhaul is not just an economic reform, but a strategic statement. India's growth story will not be held hostage by external shocks. It will be sustained by the resilience of its own citizens and enterprises. In conclusion, the domestic economic logic of Modi's tax overhaul rests on three pillars: stimulating demand by lowering the cost of essentials, supporting businesses, especially MSMEs, by easing compliance and lowering rates, positioning India for resilience against global trade headwinds by strengthening internal markets. Yes, this will strain government finances in the short term. But if Modi's gamble pays off, it could lay the foundation for a new cycle of growth, compliance, and political stability. Ladies and gentlemen, economic reforms in India are never just about numbers on a balance sheet. They are about people, perceptions, and power. Prime Minister Modi's tax overhaul must be seen not only as an economic move, but also as a deeply political one. At the political level, the reform strengthens Modi's image as a leader of the people. By lowering taxes on essentials such as food, clothing, and household items, he positions himself as a protector of the middle class and the poor, in a country where the average household often struggles with rising costs. This tax relief will be felt immediately in day-to-day lives. Politically, this translates into gratitude at the ballot box. Citizens may not always understand macroeconomics, but they remember when their monthly grocery bill goes down. The timing also matters. India is moving toward a new electoral cycle, with state elections looming and national elections on the horizon. Opposition parties will, of course, criticize the revenue shortfall, warning of cuts to welfare schemes or infrastructure spending. But Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party (BJP) is betting that voters value immediate relief more than abstract concerns about fiscal deficits. In electoral politics, short-term relief often outweighs long-term caution. Socially, the reform is designed to build inclusivity. By targeting essential goods, it directly benefits lower-income families who spend a larger share of their earnings on basic necessities. It also reduces the perception of inequality in the tax system. For decades, India's poor have felt burdened by indirect taxes that fall disproportionately on them. A lower GST on essentials is seen as a step toward fairness and social justice. There is also a broader nationalist narrative at play. At a time when U.S.-India trade tensions dominate headlines, Modi's government is telling citizens, "We will take care of our own." Even if the world raises barriers, India will ensure its people do not suffer. This message resonates strongly with Modi's core support base, which values both economic relief and national pride. Of course, critics warn that populist tax cuts could weaken India's ability to invest in health, education, and rural development. Yet, the political genius of this reform is that it shields Modi from such criticism because the benefits are immediate, visible and felt across households. In sum, the political and social implications of this tax overhaul are profound. It boosts Modi's popularity, strengthens his party's electoral prospects, and reinforces a narrative of inclusive growth in the face of global uncertainty. Ladies and gentlemen, no economic decision in India today can be seen in isolation from the global context, particularly the relationship with the United States. Modi's tax overhaul is not only a domestic policy, but also a signal to international partners, a declaration that India is prepared to shield its people from external shocks, even as it faces rising trade tensions with Washington. Let us recall the backdrop. The U.S., under President Trump, has been rethinking trade partnerships, withdrawing concessions and imposing tariffs on several countries, including India. Earlier, the U.S. ended India's preferential trade status under the Generalized System of Preferences (GSP), which had allowed Indian exporters easier access to American markets. This move hit India's small and medium enterprises, particularly in sectors like textiles, jewelry, and pharmaceuticals. In response, India imposed tariffs of its own on certain American goods. What followed was a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, India wanted to defend its interests, but on the other, it did not want to alienate the U.S., a crucial partner for defense, technology, and investment. This tug-of-war defines the present trade relationship. Now, how does Modi's tax reform connect to this larger picture? In simple terms, it is economic armor. By lowering taxes on essential goods at home, Modi ensures that Indian consumers feel cushioned against the rising costs that might result from global trade conflicts. If U.S. tariffs make imports more expensive, the domestic tax cuts offset some of that pain. The message is clear. India will not allow Washington's decisions to dictate its domestic stability. Furthermore, the reform strengthens Modi's hand in negotiations with the U.S. By demonstrating fiscal flexibility and domestic support, he enters trade talks not as a leader under pressure, but as one who has reassured his people. This boosts India's bargaining position, showing that the government is willing to take bold steps at home to counter external threats. From an international perspective, this move also reassures global investors. They see an India that is proactive rather than reactive, one that is ready to support its population even in times of global uncertainty. In the long run, this builds credibility and investor confidence, especially as India positions itself as a manufacturing hub competing with China. In short, Modi's tax overhaul is more than a domestic gesture, it is a strategic international signal. It tells Washington and the world that India will engage in global trade, but not at the cost of its citizens' welfare. While Modi's tax overhaul has been celebrated as bold and people-friendly, it is not without risks and criticisms. Economists warn that lowering taxes on essential goods, while politically popular, could lead to short-term revenue losses for the government, at a time when India needs strong fiscal reserves to invest in infrastructure, defense, and social programs. This dip in revenue could strain the state's ability to fund long-term projects. Critics also point out that tax reforms alone cannot shield India from the consequences of global trade tensions. If U.S. tariffs significantly disrupt exports or if oil prices rise due to international pressures, India may face inflationary pressures that no domestic tax cut can fully offset. This could put the burden back on consumers and neutralize the intended benefits. Additionally, opposition leaders accuse Modi of using the reform as a political tool rather than an economic necessity. They argue that the policy was designed more to boost his image as a protector of the common man than to address the structural weaknesses of India's economy. In short, while the reform is bold and symbolic, it carries financial risks and faces criticism about its sustainability in the long run. The political implications of Modi's tax overhaul are perhaps as significant as its economic impact. Domestically, the move has been framed as a people-first decision, showcasing Modi as a leader who listens to the struggles of ordinary citizens. By reducing the burden on essential goods and ensuring that farmers and middle-class families feel some relief, the government has crafted a narrative of empathy and responsiveness. This is crucial ahead of regional elections, where economic issues often dominate public discourse. For Modi, the reform strengthens his image as a decisive reformer willing to take risks. In the eyes of his supporters, it represents continuity of the pro-poor, pro-reform agenda that has defined much of his governance. Opposition parties, though critical of the fiscal risks, find it difficult to argue against a policy that directly benefits households. This limits their ability to weaponize the issue politically. On the global stage, the reform positions India as a resilient and adaptive economy amid U.S. trade tensions, while Washington imposes tariffs and pressures allies. India projects itself as a country focused on internal stability and self-reliance. This not only reassures international investors, but also signals to major powers that India is determined to chart its own course. However, critics argue that such populist reforms may complicate India's negotiations with the U.S., as American policymakers could perceive them as political maneuvers rather than long-term economic planning. Nevertheless, in terms of political capital, Modi has successfully used the reform to consolidate domestic support while maintaining international visibility. As we conclude this discussion, it becomes clear that Prime Minister Modi's tax overhaul is not merely an economic reform, it is a political statement and strategic positioning tool. On the surface, the reform may tighten India's fiscal space, reduce immediate revenues, and strain public finances. But beyond the numbers lies a deliberate effort to reshape India's global and domestic image. Domestically, Modi has showcased himself as a leader willing to prioritize citizens over fiscal orthodoxy. By easing tax burdens on households and farmers at a time when global trade tensions threaten growth, he reinforces his reputation as a leader of the people. This could translate into stronger electoral support, particularly from the rural and middle-class segments that form the backbone of India's democracy. Internationally, the reform signals India's determination to remain resilient, self-reliant, and reform-oriented, even amid external pressures such as U.S. tariffs. For investors, this offers a message of stability and adaptability. For strategic partners, it underscores India's intent to pursue balanced relationships while safeguarding its economic independence. Yet, challenges remain. India must balance the populist appeal of tax reforms with the realities of fiscal discipline. Rising deficits, slowing exports, and volatile global energy prices could test the sustainability of these reforms. At the same time, trade negotiations with the U.S. may become more complex if American policymakers perceive India's domestic steps as tactical rather than structural. Ultimately, the tax overhaul reflects a delicate balancing act: short-term strain for long-term credibility, short-term costs for long-term trust. Modi has bet on the resilience of India's economy and the patience of its people. If successful, this reform could cement his legacy as a leader who steered India through turbulence with both courage and conviction.